Tonight, dear friend, we travel back in time to America's first great national parks. Long before radios, paved roads, or visitor centers, a lone ranger begins another peaceful day beneath towering pine trees. His closest companions are the whispering forests, quiet rivers, wandering elk, and endless mountain skies. Together, we'll spend an entire year following the forgotten life of one of America's earliest national park rangers, arrival at the ranger station. Tonight, dear friend, we travel back in time to the American West, to an age when the nation's first great parks were still young, their winding trails known only to a handful of travelers, explorers, and the quiet men entrusted with watching over them. Before roads were paved, before radios carried voices across the mountains, and before millions of visitors arrived each year, these wild places belonged mostly to the whisper of pine trees, the slow movement of rivers, and the patient rhythm of the seasons. So, settle comfortably beneath your blanket, allow the day to gently drift behind you, and imagine the fresh scent of mountain air filling your lungs. As the firelight flickers softly nearby, let us begin a peaceful journey into the forgotten life of an 1890s National Park Ranger. The first hint of dawn touched the distant mountain peaks long before the valley below awoke. High above the forests, the snowy summits caught the earliest golden light, glowing quietly against a pale blue sky. Lower down, thin ribbons of mist drifted between towering lodgepole pines, wrapping the hillsides in a soft blanket that would slowly disappear with the morning sun. Somewhere beyond those trees, a clear river sang its endless song over smooth stones. A raven called once from the top of a weathered pine before gliding silently into the cool morning air. In another direction came the distant bugle of an elk, echoing gently across the wide valley before fading once more into silence. It was a world that seemed content to wake slowly. Tucked beside a narrow mountain trail stood a small log cabin, its rough-hewn walls built from sturdy pine cut many years earlier. The roof was covered with hand-split cedar shingles, weathered silver by countless seasons of sun, rain, and snow. A neat stack of firewood rested beneath a simple lean-to beside the cabin, protected from the weather by another sloping roof of rough timber. A thin stream of pale gray smoke drifted upward from the stone chimney. Inside, the warmth of a small cast-iron stove gently filled the single-room cabin. An oil lantern still burned softly upon a wooden table, though its light had begun to fade beneath the growing brightness outside. Beside the stove rested a pair of polished leather riding boots. Nearby hung a broad-brimmed campaign hat, carefully brushed clean after yesterday's patrol. Everything inside the cabin had its proper place. Nothing seemed hurried. Nothing appeared wasted. This was the home of Ranger Samuel Whitaker, a man in his early 40s whose life had become quietly intertwined with the mountains surrounding him. His face carried the gentle lines of many seasons spent beneath open skies. Sunlight had bronzed his skin, while long winters had taught him patience rather than haste. His beard remained neatly trimmed, touched here and there by the first hints of gray. He had served in these mountains for several years now, long enough to recognize individual trees along familiar trails, long enough to predict tomorrow's weather by watching the evening clouds, long enough to know which meadow the elk preferred each spring and where the bears searched for berries during late summer. Samuel opened his eyes just before sunrise, as he always did. No alarm clock disturbed his rest. Years of quiet routine had become more reliable than any mechanical device. For a few peaceful moments he remained beneath his thick wool blanket, listening. The crackling stove, the gentle wind brushing the cabin walls, the distant murmur of flowing water. Every morning began with these familiar companions. He smiled softly before swinging his feet onto the smooth wooden floor. The cabin felt pleasantly cool, encouraging him to stir the glowing embers waiting patiently inside the stove. With practiced movements, he added 2 carefully dried pieces of pine. Almost immediately, bright orange flames stretched upward once again. Soon, warmth slowly returned to every corner of the room. A black iron kettle found its place above the fire. Fresh spring water, carried the evening before from a nearby stream, began warming for coffee. The comforting aroma would soon become part of another ordinary morning. While the water heated, Samuel folded his blanket neatly across the simple wooden bed. There was little furniture inside the cabin: a sturdy oak table, 2 handmade chairs, a narrow bookshelf holding several treasured volumes on birds, trees, geology, and maps, a leather-bound journal, a small cupboard containing flour, beans, oats, coffee, dried apples, salt pork, and honey. Each object had been chosen for usefulness rather than decoration. Life on the mountain rewarded simplicity. Above the table hung a carefully drawn map of Yellowstone National Park. The paper had grown soft from years of use. Tiny handwritten notes marked trails, river crossings, geyser basins, ranger cabins, and places where bridges occasionally required repair after spring floods. Samuel studied that map nearly every morning, not because he had forgotten the landscape. Quite the opposite. He enjoyed seeing the familiar places before riding through them once again. As the kettle began to whisper softly, he measured fresh coffee into a blue enamel pot. Its rich aroma slowly filled the cabin, blending pleasantly with the scent of burning pine. Breakfast remained modest: a bowl of warm oatmeal, a spoonful of local honey, fresh bread baked several days earlier, strong black coffee. It was enough. Outside, daylight continued spreading across the valley. Golden sunlight reached the tops of the tallest pines first before slowly descending toward the forest floor. Tiny droplets of dew sparkled upon grasses growing beside the cabin porch. Nearby, a curious red squirrel hurried across a fallen log, stopping briefly to inspect the quiet cabin before disappearing into a cluster of evergreen branches. Samuel carried his coffee onto the small front porch. The wooden boards creaked gently beneath his boots. Before him stretched one of the most beautiful landscapes in America. Rolling forests reached toward distant mountain ranges. Steam drifted quietly from hidden geothermal springs scattered throughout the valleys. Far below, a river wound gracefully through broad green meadows where small groups of bison could already be seen grazing in the early light. The ranger never grew tired of this view. Each morning it seemed somehow both familiar and entirely new. Clouds gathered differently. Birds chose different branches. Sunlight painted fresh patterns across the mountains. Nature never truly repeated itself. After finishing his coffee, Samuel prepared for the day's patrol. From a wooden peg beside the door, he lifted his broad campaign hat. His thick wool coat would remain inside for now, as the morning promised gentle weather. Instead, he wore a durable wool shirt, sturdy canvas trousers, leather riding gloves, and a well-worn belt carrying only the simple tools he regularly needed: a folding knife, a compass, a small notebook, pencils, matches sealed carefully inside a waterproof tin. Nothing unnecessary. Every item earned its place through usefulness. Before leaving, Samuel opened the leather-bound journal resting upon the table. With neat handwriting, he recorded the beginning of another ordinary day. May 28th, 1894. Clear skies at sunrise. Light breeze from the southwest. No sign of overnight storms. Beginning morning patrol toward the upper geyser basin, he allowed the ink a moment to dry before gently closing the journal. Outside the stable stood his trusted horse, a calm bay gelding named Jasper. The horse lifted his head as Samuel approached, giving a quiet, familiar snort. Years together had created an easy understanding between them. Samuel stroked Jasper's neck before checking the saddle, tightening the cinch and fastening a pair of well-used leather saddlebags. Inside rested only the essentials: extra horseshoes, a small repair kit, simple medical supplies, a coil of rope, a blanket, lunch wrapped carefully in cloth. The mountain had taught him to prepare for small surprises rather than dramatic adventures. With one smooth motion, Samuel settled into the saddle. Jasper stepped calmly onto the narrow forest trail. Behind them, the little ranger cabin grew smaller among the pines. Ahead waited another peaceful day of watching over one of America's youngest national parks, where every winding path, every quiet meadow, and every whispering forest held another gentle story waiting to unfold. Morning patrol through the pines. Jasper's steady hoofbeats echoed softly along the narrow dirt trail, blending with the quiet sounds of another peaceful morning in Yellowstone. Each step pressed gently into the damp earth, still dark from the cool night air. The forest seemed in no hurry to awaken completely. Thin beams of sunlight slipped between the tall lodgepole pines, painting long golden stripes across the winding path, while patches of mist lingered beneath the branches like gentle clouds that had settled to rest upon the forest floor. Samuel kept a relaxed hand upon the leather reins. There was rarely any need to hurry. The mountains had their own pace, and over the years he had learned that the wisest way to travel through them was simply to match their rhythm. A chickadee landed upon a nearby branch, tilting its tiny head as horse and rider passed below. Somewhere higher in the trees, a woodpecker tapped patiently against an old pine trunk, each measured knock echoing softly through the still morning air. Farther away came the gentle rush of a mountain stream, hidden behind clusters of evergreen trees. These sounds formed the ranger's daily companions. Unlike the crowded streets of eastern cities, where wagon wheels and busy markets filled every hour with noise, this wilderness offered long moments when only birds, rivers, and the wind carried on their quiet conversations. Samuel found great comfort in that silence. Not an empty silence, a living one that rewarded those willing to slow down enough to hear it. The trail curved gently around a hillside where clusters of wildflowers covered the open meadow. Purple lupines swayed beside brilliant yellow balsam root blossoms, while delicate white yarrow flowers stretched toward the growing warmth of the morning sun. Countless butterflies drifted lazily from bloom to bloom, moving so gently that they almost appeared to float rather than fly. Jasper slowed without being asked. The horse knew these peaceful places well. Samuel smiled as he watched a pair of mule deer grazing quietly near the edge of the clearing. Their large ears turned toward the approaching ranger, but they showed little fear. The animals had learned that this familiar rider brought no danger. For several quiet minutes, they simply observed one another. The deer continued feeding. Samuel remained still in the saddle. Neither seemed eager to disturb the morning. Eventually, the deer lifted their graceful heads and disappeared into the shelter of the pines with effortless, silent leaps. The ranger tipped his hat ever so slightly as though saying farewell to old neighbors. A short distance farther, the trail crossed a narrow wooden bridge spanning a lively creek. Clear water rushed beneath weathered pine logs, tumbling happily over smooth gray stones polished by centuries of flowing current. Tiny brook trout darted through the crystal water, flashing silver whenever sunlight reached beneath the surface. Samuel guided Jasper onto the bridge. Before crossing completely, he stopped in the middle and looked carefully along the timber supports. Inspecting bridges was one of the many quiet responsibilities that filled a ranger's ordinary days. Heavy spring runoff sometimes loosened beams or carried fallen branches against the supports. Today everything appeared sturdy. The hand-hewn logs remained secure. Only a few pine needles had gathered between the planks. Satisfied, Samuel made a brief note in his small leather notebook. Creek Bridge, sound condition. These simple observations rarely appeared in history books, yet they quietly protected every traveler who would cross these mountains during the coming weeks. Soon the trail climbed gradually toward higher ground. The cool morning air grew even fresher beneath the dense evergreen canopy. Sunlight filtered through countless pine needles, creating moving patterns across the forest floor where ferns, mosses, and tiny woodland flowers flourished beneath the towering trees. The scent here changed as well. Warm pine resin, moist earth, fresh moss, a faint trace of wild sage carried by the breeze. Samuel often believed he could recognize each part of the park simply by its fragrance. Every valley possessed its own quiet personality. Every hillside greeted him differently. Reaching the crest of the hill, he paused beside an overlook where the entire valley stretched before him. Far below, ribbons of steam curled upward from distant geothermal springs, drifting lazily into the cool morning sky. Beyond them wandered several small herds of bison, their dark shapes moving slowly across the broad green meadows like ancient guardians of the land. Even from this distance, their peaceful strength was unmistakable. Samuel removed his field glasses from the saddlebag. Carefully crafted from polished brass and leather, they had accompanied him through many seasons of patrol. Holding them to his eyes, he slowly surveyed the valley. The bison grazed calmly. No travelers appeared lost. No smoke rose where it should not. No fallen trees blocked the visible sections of trail. Everything rested exactly as nature intended. He lowered the glasses with quiet satisfaction. Many people imagined a ranger's work was filled with excitement. The truth was gentler. Most days were spent watching, listening, preventing small problems before they became larger ones. It required patience more than bravery, observation more than action. Those suited to the work found deep contentment in these peaceful routines. Jasper carried Samuel onward toward a small meadow bordered by aspens whose bright green leaves shimmered with every passing breeze. Their delicate round leaves produced a soft whisper unlike the deeper rustling of the surrounding pines. The ranger often paused here simply to listen. The mountain possessed many voices. The aspens spoke one language, the river another, the wind across open grasslands another still. Together they created a quiet symphony that changed with every season. As the morning unfolded, sunlight grew warmer, and tiny wisps of mist finally disappeared into the blue western sky. A pair of red-tailed hawks circled gracefully overhead, riding invisible currents of warm air rising from the valley below. Samuel watched until they became little more than dark silhouettes against the brilliant sky. There would be many more miles to ride before evening returned him to the little cabin among the pines. But there was no reason to think about the journey's end. Out here, every gentle bend in the trail offered another quiet discovery, another peaceful landscape, another reminder that caring for these young national parks often meant doing something wonderfully simple, being present enough to notice them. Visitors from the east. The trail gradually descended from the quiet pine-covered ridge toward a broad valley where the morning sunshine lingered a little longer. Here the forest opened into rolling meadows dotted with clusters of sagebrush and wildflowers, while a clear stream wandered lazily across the grasslands before disappearing once again beneath the shelter of towering evergreens. Jasper continued at his familiar, unhurried pace. Samuel allowed the reins to rest loosely in his gloved hands. The ranger knew nearly every bend of this trail as well as some people knew the streets of their hometowns. He recognized the shape of certain weathered boulders, the old pine that lightning had split years before, and the gentle curve where the first bluebells always appeared each spring. These quiet landmarks had become trusted companions. The air was beginning to warm now, though the mountain breeze still carried a pleasant coolness. Every breath tasted wonderfully fresh, touched with the fragrance of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of blooming lupines scattered across the nearby hillsides. A small flock of mountain bluebirds fluttered among the fence posts that marked one section of the trail. Their brilliant feathers almost seemed to borrow their color from the wide western sky itself. Samuel paused long enough to enjoy their cheerful company before continuing onward. Not far ahead, he noticed something different. Very faint at first, almost too quiet to recognize. The slow creaking of wooden wheels, the soft jingle of harness chains. Then came the steady footsteps of draft horses climbing the gradual hill. Visitors. Samuel smiled gently. Although Yellowstone remained wonderfully isolated during the 1890s, each summer welcomed a small but growing number of travelers who wished to experience America's remarkable new national parks for themselves. Most had journeyed hundreds of miles by railroad before boarding sturdy stagecoaches or wagons for the final days of travel through mountain country. Many arrived dusty, tired, and quietly amazed by the landscape surrounding them. Around the next bend appeared a large covered wagon pulled by two powerful bay horses. The white canvas cover showed patches carefully sewn over years of faithful service. Boxes, blankets, cooking pots, and wooden trunks were tied securely along the sides. Walking beside the wagon was a middle-aged gentleman wearing a dark felt hat. His wife rode comfortably inside beside two young children, who peered excitedly through the open canvas flap at the forest stretching endlessly around them. A shaggy sheepdog trotted happily behind the wagon, occasionally stopping to sniff the roadside grasses before catching up once again. When the family noticed Samuel approaching on horseback, they smiled with visible relief. The gentleman removed his hat politely. "Good morning, Ranger, and a very good morning to you," Samuel replied warmly, tipping his own hat in return. "You've traveled quite a distance." "We certainly have," the traveler answered with a quiet laugh. "From Boston, if you can believe it." Samuel's eyes brightened. "Then Yellowstone must seem like another world." "It truly does." The gentleman glanced slowly toward the surrounding mountains. "I've never imagined a place so peaceful." Samuel understood exactly what he meant. Many Eastern visitors arrived expecting grand scenery. What surprised them most was often the silence. No factory whistles, no crowded streets, no endless lines of buildings. Only forests, mountains, rivers, and skies that seemed impossibly large. The ranger guided Jasper beside the wagon as they walked together for a short distance. "How has the journey treated you?" "Long," the gentleman admitted, smiling. "But worth every mile." One of the young children leaned eagerly from the wagon. "Mr. Ranger?" Samuel looked toward the curious boy. "Yes? Have you really seen bears?" Samuel chuckled softly. "I have. Lots? A few." The boy's eyes grew wide. "Were you scared?" Samuel considered the question carefully before answering. "Only when I forgot to respect how wild they are." The child nodded thoughtfully. His younger sister clutched a small cloth doll and whispered, "Do the bears come into your cabin?" "Very rarely," Samuel answered kindly. "They usually prefer berries, fish, and peaceful forests far away from people." The little girl smiled with obvious relief. Their mother laughed quietly. "I think you've helped everyone feel more comfortable." Samuel was pleased. Helping visitors understand the wilderness formed an important part of his work. Not simply telling people where to travel, but showing them how to become respectful guests within nature's home. As they continued walking, Samuel pointed towards several towering pine trees standing near the trail. "You may notice scars low upon those trunks." The gentleman looked more closely. "They appear blackened." "Old fire marks," Samuel explained. "Many years ago, lightning passed through this forest. The fire moved slowly along the ground, clearing brush without destroying the oldest trees. So fire isn't always harmful?" "Not always." Samuel rested one hand lightly upon the saddle horn. Sometimes nature quietly renews itself in ways we are only beginning to understand. The traveler nodded with genuine interest. For several moments they walked without speaking, There was no need to fill every silence with conversation. The steady creak of wagon wheels, the rhythmic footsteps of horses, and the songs of meadowlarks created pleasant company all by themselves. Eventually, the trail reached a small clearing beside a sparkling creek. Here stood several sturdy wooden picnic tables built by earlier work crews, along with a stone fire ring and a hitching rail for horses. Samuel stopped Jasper. "This makes a fine place to rest before continuing toward the geyser basin." The family looked around appreciatively. It couldn't be more beautiful. The children hurried carefully toward the creek, accompanied by their mother, while the father began unhitching one of the water barrels. Samuel dismounted to help fill their buckets from the cold mountain stream. The water was wonderfully clear. Snowmelt from distant peaks had traveled through forests and rocky valleys before reaching this peaceful place. The gentleman cupped his hands and took a refreshing drink. "I've never tasted water like this." Samuel smiled. "The mountains are generous." Nearby, the sheepdog stretched comfortably beneath the shade of a tall pine while Jasper grazed quietly among the meadow grasses. The ranger noticed the young boy collecting smooth stones along the edge of the creek. Each one seemed a tiny treasure. One was pale green, another nearly black. One shimmered with tiny flecks of quartz that sparkled brightly beneath the afternoon sun. Children had a remarkable way of discovering beauty adults sometimes hurried past. Before long, Samuel unfolded a simple map from his saddlebag. Spreading it carefully across one of the picnic tables, he traced the family's route with one gloved finger. "This trail will lead you safely to the upper geyser basin before evening," he said. "If you continue at a comfortable pace, you'll arrive well before sunset." The gentleman studied the map carefully. "And where will you be?" Samuel looked toward the distant forest where another quiet trail disappeared among the pines. "I'll continue my patrol. There are bridges to inspect, campsites to visit, and another ranger station farther north that expects my arrival before tomorrow." The father smiled warmly. "It seems a lonely occupation." Samuel glanced toward the mountains glowing softly beneath the afternoon light. For a thoughtful moment, he simply listened to the breeze moving through the pines. Then he answered with quiet certainty. "Not lonely," he smiled gently. "Only wonderfully peaceful." The family thanked him once more before climbing back into their wagon. The horses leaned into their harnesses, the wheels turned slowly, and the travelers continued deeper into Yellowstone, carrying fresh memories that would likely remain with them for the rest of their lives. Samuel watched until the wagon disappeared around a distant bend. Then he adjusted Jasper's saddle, settled comfortably once again, and turned toward another quiet trail leading deeper into the endless forests, where the afternoon still held many gentle discoveries waiting beneath the whispering pines. Watching the living wilderness, the wagon's gentle creaking faded slowly into the distance until it became indistinguishable from the whisper of wind moving through the pines. For a few moments, Samuel remained beside the meadow, watching the trail where the family had disappeared. He always felt a quiet satisfaction after helping travelers find their way through the park. Most arrived carrying curiosity, and he hoped they left carrying respect for the wilderness that welcomed them. Jasper lifted his head from the grass and gave a soft snort, as if reminding the ranger that the afternoon patrol was not yet finished. Samuel smiled. "You're right, old friend." He settled back into the saddle, and together they followed a narrower trail leading north toward a broad valley known for its wildlife. The path wound through stands of lodgepole pine where sunlight flickered across the ground like moving patches of gold. Every so often, the forest opened just enough to reveal distant mountains rising blue and quiet beyond the trees. The air had grown warmer since morning, carrying the rich scent of pine resin and sunlit earth. Somewhere nearby, a squirrel scolded them from the safety of a high branch before darting out of sight. Farther away came the steady murmur of a river hidden among the rocks. As the trail descended, Samuel slowed Jasper to a walk. This valley belonged to the bison. He had learned long ago that entering such places required patience. The great animals were peaceful when left undisturbed, and the ranger preferred to move through their world as gently as possible. Soon the trees thinned, revealing a wide meadow stretching toward the river. Dark shapes dotted the grasslands ahead. Bison. Dozens of them. Some grazed quietly with their heads lowered. Others stood motionless, flicking their tails against the occasional fly. Several calves, smaller and lighter in color, stayed close beside their mothers as they wandered through the tall grass. Samuel guided Jasper to the edge of the meadow and stopped beneath a solitary pine. From there, horse and rider could watch without causing concern. The valley was wonderfully peaceful. A warm breeze rolled through the grass, creating soft waves that moved around the bison like water around stones in a stream. Meadowlarks sang from hidden fence posts, and dragonflies flashed blue and green above the riverbank. Samuel removed his field glasses and studied the herd. Healthy animals, calm behavior, no signs of injury. These observations would later find their way into his journal, though the notes themselves would be brief. Much of a ranger's work consisted of noticing small details before anyone else had reason to notice them. One large bull stood slightly apart from the others, his massive shoulders catching the afternoon light. Even at a distance, his size was impressive, yet there was nothing aggressive in his posture. He simply watched the valley with the quiet confidence of a creature that had walked these grasslands long before fences, wagons, or ranger cabins appeared. Samuel felt a familiar sense of humility whenever he saw them. The park was young, the ranger service was young, but the wilderness was ancient. The bison reminded him of that. After a time, he nudged Jasper forward along the edge of the meadow, keeping a respectful distance from the herd. The trail climbed gently toward a low ridge where clusters of aspens trembled in the breeze. Their leaves made a soft, musical sound unlike the deeper whisper of the pines. At the top of the rise, Samuel paused again. Below him, the river curved through the valley in bright silver loops. Along one sandy bank stood a small group of elk. A cow lifted her head from the water, droplets falling from her muzzle as she looked toward the ridge. Nearby, two calves stayed close together, their ears turning at every sound. Jasper remained perfectly still. The elk drank for another minute before moving slowly back into the shelter of the trees. The ranger watched until the last tawny shape disappeared among the shadows. Wildlife was easiest to observe when nothing felt hurried. The afternoon drifted on. Clouds gathered lazily above the mountains, though their white tops remained bright in the sun. Samuel followed the trail toward a rocky overlook he often visited during patrols. From there, much of the valley could be seen at once. When he reached it, he dismounted and let Jasper graze among the grasses while he walked to the edge. The view spread before him like a painted map. Forests, rivers, meadows, distant geyser steam rising in thin white ribbons, and everywhere the quiet movement of life. A hawk circled high overhead, riding invisible currents of warm air. Near the river, several sandhill cranes stepped carefully through the shallows, their reflections wavering in the water. Samuel rested one hand on the warm stone beside him. People often spoke of Yellowstone's great geysers and waterfalls, and rightly so. But some of the park's finest moments were much quieter. A grazing bison, an elk at the river, the sound of wind through aspens, the long shadows of afternoon stretching across an empty valley. Those were the moments he carried with him. After a while, he returned to Jasper and continued along the ridge. The trail narrowed between weathered rocks before descending once more into the forest. Here the air grew cooler, shaded by tall evergreens that had stood for generations. A sudden flutter of wings made Samuel look up. a flock of grouse burst from the underbrush, startling Jasper only slightly before disappearing deeper among the trees. The ranger laughed softly. "Easy now." Jasper flicked an ear as if embarrassed by the brief surprise. The forest soon settled again. As the sun began its slow journey toward the western mountains, the light changed from bright gold to a warmer amber. Long shadows stretched across the trail, and the evening air carried the first hint of coming coolness. Samuel knew he would not reach the cabin before dark unless he turned back soon. Still, before leaving the valley, he guided Jasper to one final overlook. The bison herd remained in the meadow below. The river still shimmered. The cranes had taken flight, their long wings carrying them toward the distant marshes. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked exactly as it should. Samuel lifted his hat for a moment and let the breeze pass through his hair. Then he settled it back on his head, gathered the reins, and turned Jasper toward the long forest trail that would lead them home through the whispering pines. The quiet wonders of the Upper Geyser Basin. By the time Samuel and Jasper reached the edge of the Upper Geyser Basin, the afternoon had settled into its gentlest hours. The bright energy of midday had softened, and the sun now cast a warm, honey-colored light across the broad valley. Long shadows stretched peacefully from the scattered lodgepole pines, while ribbons of white steam drifted lazily upward into the clear western sky. Even before the basin came fully into view, the ranger could hear it. Not the roar of waterfalls or the rush of rivers. Something quieter, a gentle bubbling, the soft hiss of escaping steam, the occasional splash of warm mineral water returning to the earth. Together, these sounds formed a calm and steady melody unlike anywhere else in America. Jasper slowed naturally as they approached. The horse had traveled this route many times and was familiar with the unusual sights and scents. Warm steam curled across parts of the trail, carrying with it the faint mineral fragrance of sulfur and hot stone. Though unfamiliar to many visitors, Samuel had long ago grown accustomed to the smell. To him, it simply meant he had arrived in one of Yellowstone's most remarkable landscapes. Ahead, dozens of steaming pools shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Some reflected the sky like polished mirrors. Others glowed with delicate shades of pale blue, emerald green, or soft turquoise, their colors created by minerals and tiny forms of life thriving in the warm water. Steam drifted slowly above each spring, sometimes hiding them completely before revealing them again a few moments later. It was a landscape that seemed almost dreamlike. Yet every pool, every bubbling spring, and every plume of steam belonged entirely to the natural world. Samuel guided Jasper along the carefully marked trail, keeping to the established route that protected both visitors and the fragile geothermal features. In these early years of the national park, wooden boardwalks had begun appearing near the busiest areas. Built from sturdy pine planks raised slightly above the ground, they allowed travelers to explore safely without damaging the delicate mineral crust beneath their feet. Samuel dismounted and tied Jasper beneath the shade of a small cluster of pines where fresh grass waited nearby. "You've earned a quiet rest," he said softly, patting the horse's neck. Jasper answered with a contented snort before lowering his head to graze. Samuel stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. Its weathered planks creaked gently beneath his boots. The warm air carried tiny droplets of moisture that settled lightly upon his sleeves. Every few steps revealed another beautiful spring or quietly steaming vent. Some pools remained perfectly still. Others bubbled gently, releasing small circles that expanded slowly across the crystal-clear surface before disappearing once more. The ranger paused beside one especially beautiful spring. The water was astonishingly transparent. Even several feet below the surface, smooth mineral formations could be seen resting quietly beneath the water. Shades of deep sapphire gradually faded into lighter blues near the edges, where golden mineral deposits formed delicate patterns that looked almost like brushstrokes from an artist's hand. Samuel removed his notebook. Blue pool remains clear, steam moderate, boardwalk in good condition. The entry occupied only a few lines, yet such observations quietly helped preserve the park year after year. A little farther along the path, Samuel noticed fresh footprints pressed into the fine dust beside the boardwalk. He knelt for a closer look. Large, round, clearly defined, bison. The tracks crossed the trail before disappearing toward a nearby meadow where fresh grasses grew. Satisfied that the animals had already moved on peacefully, Samuel stood once again. Wild creatures often wandered through the geothermal basins. The warm ground remained attractive even during cooler months, and many animals seemed as curious about the steaming earth as human visitors. Nearby, a Clark's nutcracker landed upon a weathered pine branch. The gray and black bird cocked its head toward Samuel before giving a harsh but somehow cheerful call. The ranger smiled. He had come to recognize individual birds that regularly visited this basin. Whether they truly remembered him, he could never know, but he enjoyed believing they did. As he continued walking, a distant splash echoed across the basin. Several visitors standing near a famous geyser looked toward the sound with quiet anticipation. Samuel joined them at a respectful distance. There was no crowd. Only a handful of travelers, a retired school teacher from Ohio, a young couple celebrating their first year of marriage, two brothers from Montana traveling with a pack mule, an elderly photographer carefully adjusting his heavy wooden camera upon its sturdy tripod. Nobody spoke loudly. The peaceful surroundings seemed to encourage softer voices. The school teacher smiled at Samuel. "Good afternoon, Ranger. Good afternoon. Do you believe she'll erupt today?" Samuel looked toward the familiar cone rising quietly from the mineral plain. "I believe she might. How can you tell?" He smiled gently. "Mostly experience." The woman laughed kindly. "I suppose that's the best answer." Together they waited. No one appeared impatient. There was something surprisingly pleasant about simply standing quietly beneath the open sky. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. Steam curled upward. The warm earth breathed softly beneath their feet. Minutes passed without hurry. Then, almost without warning, the geyser stirred. A low, bubbling sound emerged from deep below the earth. Steam thickened. Water splashed gently over the rim. The visitors leaned forward ever so slightly. Samuel remained perfectly calm. He had witnessed this remarkable sight many times before. Yet it never seemed ordinary. The bubbling grew stronger. Then, with graceful confidence rather than violence, a tall column of sparkling water rose into the afternoon sunlight. The fountain climbed steadily skyward, shining like thousands of tiny diamonds before falling gently back toward the earth. Sunlight passed through the spray, creating a faint rainbow that appeared for only a few wonderful moments. Nobody cheered. Nobody rushed. Instead, the small gathering simply watched in quiet admiration. Nature required no applause, only attention. The eruption continued for several peaceful minutes before gradually slowing once again. The great column became a smaller fountain. The smaller fountain became gentle bubbling. Finally, only drifting steam remained. The elderly photographer removed the dark cloth from over his camera. "I do believe," he said with a satisfied smile, "that was worth carrying this heavy machine all the way from Chicago." Samuel chuckled softly. "I imagine it was." As the visitors slowly continued along the boardwalk, the ranger remained behind for another few moments. The basin had become quiet once more. Only steam rose gently into the afternoon air. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the cool mountain breeze mingled with the warmth rising from the earth below. Few places reminded him more clearly that Yellowstone was unlike anywhere else. Here, deep beneath the mountains, unseen forces had patiently shaped the landscape for thousands upon thousands of years. The ranger's own lifetime was only the briefest moment within that endless story. He found that thought wonderfully comforting. With one last look across the steaming valley, Samuel returned to Jasper. The faithful horse lifted his head as if asking whether the day's journey would continue. Samuel smiled as he loosened the reins. Yes, old friend, there is still plenty of daylight left, and these mountains have a few more quiet stories to share before evening. An evening at the ranger outpost. Samuel swung easily into the saddle, and Jasper stepped away from the steaming basin with the same calm confidence that had carried them across countless miles of mountain trails. Behind them, the warm breath of the geysers slowly faded into the distance, replaced once again by the familiar whisper of lodgepole pines and the cheerful murmur of a nearby creek. The afternoon had begun its gentle journey toward evening. Sunlight filtered through the forest with a softer glow now, turning the bark of the pines a warm shade of amber. Long shadows stretched quietly across the trail, and the mountain air carried the pleasant fragrance of sun-warmed needles mixed with cool earth rising from the shaded ground. Samuel breathed deeply. Every season had its own scent. Spring smelled of melting snow and fresh grass. Summer carried pine resin, wildflowers, and warm stone. Autumn would eventually bring the rich fragrance of fallen leaves and crisp mornings. Winter, though still many months away, always arrived with the clean scent of snow and spruce. He loved each one equally. The trail followed the gentle curves of a narrow river whose clear waters reflected patches of blue sky between the trees. Small trout occasionally broke the surface, creating delicate circles that widened slowly before disappearing into the steady current. A kingfisher darted low above the water, its brilliant blue feathers flashing in the afternoon light before vanishing around a bend. Samuel watched it disappear with a quiet smile. Birds often served as the first signs of changing seasons. Some remained throughout the year. Others appeared only briefly before continuing their remarkable migrations across the continent. Few people realized how carefully rangers observed such things. Knowing when birds arrived or departed often revealed subtle changes occurring throughout the wilderness. Nature spoke softly. One simply had to listen. After another peaceful mile, the forest began to thin. Ahead stood a modest clearing where another log cabin rested beneath a stand of tall spruce trees. Unlike Samuel's own cabin, this building served as a small ranger outpost, one of several scattered across Yellowstone to provide shelter for men patrolling distant sections of the park. Its weathered log walls glowed warmly beneath the lowering sun. A split-rail fence enclosed a tiny corral where two horses grazed lazily beside a small haystack. Thin curls of smoke drifted from the chimney. Someone was already home. As Jasper approached the gate, another ranger stepped out onto the porch. He was younger than Samuel by perhaps 10 years, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair, and an easy smile that appeared almost as naturally as the evening sunlight. Afternoon, Sam. Afternoon, Thomas. Thomas Harper had arrived at Yellowstone only 2 summers earlier. Though still learning many of the mountain trails, he had quickly earned a reputation for patience, careful observation, and genuine respect for the land. The two men greeted each other with a warm handshake. "Quiet patrol?" Thomas asked. "Very quiet." Samuel removed his gloves. "Just the way I like them." Thomas laughed softly. "I'll take quiet over exciting every time." Inside the cabin, the air felt comfortably warm from a cast-iron stove where a small kettle simmered gently. The room resembled Samuel's own home in many ways. Simple wooden furniture, shelves lined with practical supplies, a rough table covered by neatly folded maps, several lanterns waiting for nightfall. A pair of snowshoes still hung upon one wall despite the arrival of summer, ready for the seasons ahead. Everything suggested preparation rather than luxury. Thomas poured fresh coffee into 2 sturdy enamel cups. "I roasted a little extra this morning." Samuel accepted the cup gratefully. The rich aroma filled the cabin almost immediately. Few comforts matched hot coffee after a day spent riding mountain trails. The 2 men settled into sturdy wooden chairs beside the open doorway where the cool evening breeze drifted gently inside. Neither seemed eager to interrupt the peaceful silence too quickly. Eventually, Thomas asked, "Many visitors today? A pleasant family from Boston." Samuel smiled. "The children were convinced every bear wanted to visit my cabin." Thomas chuckled. "I remember believing the same thing when I was their age. They left feeling much better." "Good!" Helping visitors understand wildlife had become one of the Ranger Service's quiet successes. Fear often came from unfamiliarity. Knowledge usually replaced fear with respect. Thomas unfolded one of the park maps across the table. Several sections had been carefully marked with pencil notes from recent patrols. "Bridge near Pelican Creek is holding well." Samuel nodded. "I inspected another this morning. Solid as ever." "Any trouble with campers?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing serious." He pointed toward a small note written beside one trail. "One group left their campfire burning yesterday." Samuel's expression became thoughtful. "Did they understand the danger?" "I believe so." Thomas smiled. They seemed genuinely thankful someone explained it. Samuel appreciated hearing that. Most visitors wanted to do the right thing. Many simply lacked experience in the wilderness. Patient guidance accomplished far more than harsh words. Outside, evening continued settling across the valley. A pair of horses grazed quietly beyond the fence while swallows skimmed gracefully above the meadow, catching insects in the cooling air. The distant call of a sandhill crane echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the river. Samuel stepped onto the porch carrying his coffee. The view from the outpost overlooked miles of untouched forest stretching toward mountains now painted in gentle shades of gold and lavender. The lowering sun illuminated the highest peaks while the valleys below slowly filled with cool blue shadows. Thomas joined him. "It never looks quite the same twice." Samuel nodded. "I've been telling myself that for years." "And every evening proves it true." For several minutes they simply stood together. No conversation seemed necessary. The mountains offered enough company. Eventually Thomas spoke again. "Do you ever wonder what this place will look like 50 years from now?" Samuel considered the question. "I hope." He paused thoughtfully. "I hope these forests are still standing." "I hope the rivers still run clear. I hope children can still hear elk bugling across these valleys." Thomas smiled quietly. "And I hope there are still rangers willing to ride these trails." Samuel returned the smile. "I believe there will be." The work demanded patience more than glory. Most days passed without remarkable events. No newspapers celebrated repaired bridges. Few stories were written about safely guided travelers or carefully extinguished campfires. Yet those ordinary duties quietly protected something extraordinary. That knowledge was enough. As the first stars began appearing above the eastern ridges, Thomas invited Samuel to stay for supper before continuing home the following morning. The meal was wonderfully simple. Venison stew simmered slowly with potatoes, onions, carrots, and herbs gathered from a nearby garden. Fresh bread rested inside a cloth-lined basket. A small jar of wildflower honey sat near a wedge of homemade cheese. Nothing elaborate, everything satisfying. The 2 rangers ate slowly, speaking now and then about weather, wildlife sightings, and the small tasks awaiting them during the coming week. Outside, darkness gently embraced the mountains. Lantern light glowed warmly through the cabin windows, becoming one tiny beacon within the immense wilderness. Beyond its comforting walls, Yellowstone settled peacefully into another quiet night. And somewhere far across the valley, beneath a sky filled with countless stars, the rivers continued flowing exactly as they had long before the first ranger ever rode these timeless trails. Campfire beneath the Yellowstone stars. The following morning arrived so quietly that Samuel almost seemed to awaken with the forest itself. Long before the sun climbed above the eastern mountains, a pale silver light filtered through the small cabin windows of the ranger outpost. Outside, the world rested beneath a cool blanket of dawn. The meadow glistened with dew, each blade of grass carrying tiny droplets that reflected the first hints of morning. Inside the cabin, the cast-iron stove still held a little warmth from the previous evening's fire. Thomas was already awake. Samuel could hear the familiar sounds of another ranger beginning an ordinary day. The careful placement of split pine logs into the stove, the gentle rattle of an enamel coffee pot, and the quiet scrape of a chair across the rough wooden floor. Nothing about the morning felt hurried. The mountains did not rush. Neither did the men who cared for them. Soon the rich aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the cabin once again. Thomas smiled as Samuel entered the main room. "I figured you'd wake before the coffee was ready." Samuel laughed softly. "I've never managed to sleep much after sunrise." Together they prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal sweetened with a little wildflower honey, fresh bread toasted beside the stove, and slices of dried apple that had been carefully stored for the season. Outside, Jasper and Thomas's horses waited patiently near the corral, occasionally lifting their heads to watch birds fluttering across the meadow. After breakfast, the two men stepped onto the porch. Morning mist floated gently above the grasslands, while the first rays of sunlight painted the highest mountain peaks with soft shades of gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of spruce, damp earth, and distant sage. Samuel breathed deeply. No matter how many years passed, mornings like these never became ordinary. Before leaving, Thomas handed Samuel a folded sheet of paper. "I nearly forgot. A message?" Thomas nodded. "Delivered yesterday afternoon by another patrol." Samuel unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting belonged to Superintendent George Anderson. It was brief. "Continue regular wildlife observations along the western valleys. Several reports mention increased elk activity near Hayden Meadow. No immediate concerns. Please record any notable changes." Samuel smiled. There was comfort in such ordinary instructions. No emergency, no crisis. Simply another opportunity to quietly observe the living landscape. He folded the letter neatly and tucked it inside his journal. "I'll head that direction." Thomas adjusted his own saddle. "And I'll continue south toward the canyon." The two rangers shook hands once more. "Safe travels. You as well." With gentle pressure upon the reins, Jasper began walking north along another peaceful trail disappearing beneath towering pines. The forest welcomed them once again. Morning sunlight danced between branches, illuminating patches of moss that covered fallen logs. Tiny mushrooms pushed through the damp forest floor, while ferns unfurled beneath the shelter of ancient evergreens. Everywhere there was life, yet everything remained wonderfully calm. Several miles later, Samuel reached Hayden Meadow. The broad valley stretched before him beneath a bright blue sky where white clouds drifted lazily overhead. Golden grasses rolled gently in the breeze. The Yellowstone River curved gracefully through the landscape like a silver ribbon. Near its banks grazed a large herd of elk. Dozens of them. Cows. Young calves. Several impressive bulls whose broad antlers caught the morning sunlight. Samuel guided Jasper toward a low hill overlooking the meadow. There they stopped quietly. Neither horse nor rider made unnecessary movement. The elk continued feeding peacefully. One calf bounded playfully through the tall grass before returning to its mother. Another paused beside the river, studying its own reflection for several thoughtful moments. Samuel lifted his field glasses. Everything appeared healthy, strong animals, calm behavior, no signs of disturbance. He recorded several brief notes inside his journal. Hayden Meadow. Elk herd approximately 60. Calves healthy. River conditions excellent. The entries required only a few moments. Yet one day, perhaps years later, another ranger might read these observations and discover patterns stretching across generations. The thought pleased him. Good stewardship often meant thinking beyond one's own lifetime. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel continued westward until he reached a familiar riverside campsite. The fire ring remained clean. The ground showed only faint wagon tracks left by travelers several days earlier. A small wooden bench, built by earlier patrols, still stood beneath a spreading cottonwood tree whose leaves shimmered constantly in the breeze. Samuel dismounted. Jasper wandered a short distance to graze. The ranger inspected the campsite carefully. He gathered a few scattered twigs from around the fire ring, straightened a loose cooking stone, brushed fallen leaves away from the nearby trail. Tiny tasks, almost invisible. Yet together they helped preserve the peaceful appearance visitors expected when they arrived. While working, Samuel noticed something resting beneath the bench, a child's carved wooden whistle. He picked it up gently. Simple craftsmanship, smooth pine, tiny bird carved upon one end. Perhaps the young boy from Boston had dropped it yesterday. Samuel smiled. He imagined the child searching every pocket before realizing it had been left behind. Carefully, Samuel placed the whistle inside his saddlebag. If fortune allowed, perhaps their paths would cross again before the family departed Yellowstone. Such opportunities occasionally happened. The park, though vast, often surprised its caretakers. As afternoon slowly approached, soft clouds gathered above the distant mountains. Not storm clouds, only gentle summer clouds drifting peacefully across the endless western sky. Their shadows wandered slowly over the meadows, darkening one hillside before moving gracefully onward. The rhythm reminded Samuel of waves upon a quiet sea. Later that evening, after another long but wonderfully ordinary day of riding, Samuel chose to spend the night beside the Yellowstone River rather than return immediately to his cabin. He selected a well-established ranger campsite overlooking the gently flowing water. With practiced ease, he unsaddled Jasper, allowing the faithful horse to graze nearby while he prepared a modest evening meal. Soon a small campfire burned within the stone fire ring. Its flames remained low, just enough for cooking, just enough for warmth. A simple pot of vegetable stew simmered quietly above glowing coals while fresh coffee heated beside it. The fire crackled softly. The river answered with its endless gentle song. Above, the first evening stars appeared one by one. Without city lights to dim them, the heavens unfolded with breathtaking clarity. Thousands upon thousands of stars stretched across the sky. The Milky Way arched overhead like a pale river of light flowing through the darkness. Samuel leaned comfortably against a smooth fallen log, enamel cup warming his hands. He thought about the Boston family, about Thomas, about the bison quietly grazing beneath afternoon sunshine, about the geyser rising gracefully toward the sky. Ordinary moments, small moments, yet together they formed a life richer than many people ever imagined. Nearby, Jasper rested peacefully upon the grass. An owl called softly from deep within the forest. Far across the valley came the distant howl of a lone coyote, carried gently upon the cool night air. None of the sounds disturbed the silence. They completed it. Samuel looked upward once more. Beneath those endless stars, surrounded by forests older than memory itself, he felt wonderfully small, and somehow wonderfully at home. The gentle rhythm of summer days. When the first pale light of morning touched the eastern horizon, the stars slowly surrendered the sky without complaint. One by one, they faded into the growing blue until only the brightest remained, lingering for a few quiet moments before disappearing altogether. Samuel had already awakened. Years spent living among the mountains had taught him to rise with the daylight rather than the clock. Nature kept its own gentle schedule, and he had happily adopted it. The campfire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. A faint ribbon of smoke curled upward into the cool morning air before vanishing among the branches overhead. Nearby, Jasper lifted his head from the grass and gave a quiet, familiar nicker. "Good morning," Samuel said softly. The horse stepped closer, clearly ready for another day's journey. Before anything else, Samuel walked to the river carrying his small enamel basin. The Yellowstone River flowed with its usual calm confidence, its clear water reflecting the pink and golden colors spreading across the morning sky. He knelt beside the bank. The water felt wonderfully cold against his hands. Snow from distant mountain peaks had only recently begun its long journey through countless streams before reaching this broad valley. After washing his face, Samuel paused for a moment to simply watch the current. The river never hurried, it never hesitated, it simply continued. There was something deeply comforting about that steady rhythm. Back at camp, he prepared another modest breakfast. Fresh coffee, a slice of yesterday's bread warmed beside the fire, a little cheese wrapped carefully in cloth, several dried apples. Nothing extravagant, everything sufficient. He believed simple meals somehow tasted better beneath open skies. While eating, a pair of curious chickadees landed upon a nearby fallen branch. They tilted their tiny heads towards Samuel before fluttering closer, searching for insects among the bark. The ranger watched them with quiet amusement. Birds never seemed concerned about human schedules. They lived entirely within the present moment. Perhaps people could learn something from them. Soon camp was packed once again. Every trace of the evening disappeared. The fire was completely extinguished. Ashes scattered. Cooking area cleaned. Blankets rolled neatly. By the time Samuel saddled Jasper, only flattened grass suggested anyone had rested there at all. Leaving campsites exactly as they had been found was among the earliest lessons every ranger practiced faithfully. The wilderness deserved that respect. They rode eastward along a trail following the river through open meadows where wildflowers covered the landscape like a gently woven quilt. Purple lupines, golden arnica, white yarrow, bright scarlet paintbrush. Each flower nodded softly whenever the breeze passed across the valley. Honeybees moved patiently from blossom to blossom, carrying out work far older than human memory. Samuel noticed how many butterflies had appeared during the past week. Their numbers often increased as summer reached its fullest beauty. Small white butterflies floated above the grasses almost lazily, while larger swallowtails flashed brilliant yellow whenever sunlight caught their wings. Even Jasper seemed fascinated by them, occasionally turning one ear toward a butterfly drifting past his shoulder. By mid-morning, the trail entered a broad grove of quaking aspens. Unlike the dark pines, these graceful trees seemed almost alive with movement. Even the gentlest breeze caused thousands of small round leaves to tremble together. Their soft rustling created a sound unlike any other forest. Some travelers compared it to falling rain. Others thought it resembled distant applause. Samuel simply called it the voice of the aspens. He stopped beneath their cool shade. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in countless tiny circles that danced across the ground. The air here felt noticeably cooler than the open meadows, a perfect place for both horse and rider to enjoy a few peaceful moments. While Jasper grazed nearby, Samuel opened his leather journal. Not every page contained reports. Some held quiet observations that would never appear in official records. He dipped his pen into a small bottle of ink and began writing. The aspens seem especially bright this summer. Their leaves shimmer with every passing breeze, reminding me that even stillness contains movement if one watches carefully enough. He smiled after finishing the sentence. Perhaps no superintendent would ever read those words. Still, they felt worth preserving. A ranger did not simply protect the land, he also carried its memories. A little farther down the trail, Samuel heard the steady tapping of wood against wood. Not an axe, not construction, something lighter. He followed the sound until he discovered its source. A red-naped sapsucker clung to the side of a weathered pine, carefully drilling tiny rows of holes into the bark. The bird worked with remarkable patience. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Soon sweet sap would slowly emerge, attracting insects that became part of the bird's daily meal. Samuel watched quietly for several minutes. Nature wasted very little. Every creature possessed its own place within the larger story of the forest. As the sun climbed higher, he reached another familiar overlook. From here, the land unfolded in every direction. Rolling forests, open valleys, silver rivers, steam rising faintly from distant geyser basins, snow lingering upon the highest peaks despite the warmth below. He removed his hat for a moment and allowed the breeze to cool his forehead. Many visitors came searching for spectacular sights. Samuel understood that. Yellowstone offered them generously. But over the years, he had discovered that beauty often revealed itself most completely during quiet pauses between destinations, not while hurrying, simply while noticing. As afternoon approached, he continued toward a small meadow where several bluebirds perched upon an old split-rail fence built years earlier to guide wagon traffic away from delicate wetlands. Most of the fence had weathered beautifully. Only one section leaned noticeably. Samuel dismounted and examined it carefully. Several wooden pegs had loosened after years of winter snow and spring thaw. From his saddlebag, he removed a small wooden mallet and several hand-carved replacement pegs. The repair required no more than half an hour. Each careful tap echoed softly across the quiet meadow. When finished, the fence stood straight once again. No visitor would likely notice the repair. That pleased Samuel. Good work often remained invisible. He brushed sawdust from his sleeves and stepped back to admire the simple craftsmanship. Nearby, Jasper waited patiently beneath a cottonwood tree. The horse had long ago accepted that ranger duties sometimes involved more carpentry than riding. Samuel laughed quietly at the thought. "You've learned patience better than most men." Jasper flicked an ear but offered no disagreement. Together they continued down the winding trail as warm afternoon sunlight stretched across the peaceful valley. The day had brought no emergencies, no excitement, only birds, wildflowers, aspens, quiet repairs, and countless small reminders that the wilderness thrived through ordinary care rather than extraordinary heroics. For Samuel, there could be no finer day than that. A visit to the old fire tower. Morning sunshine had long since climbed above the mountains, filling the broad Yellowstone valleys with a gentle warmth that seemed to settle over every meadow and forest alike. Samuel and Jasper continued along a narrow trail that gradually climbed toward one of the higher ridges overlooking miles of wilderness. The climb was never particularly steep. Instead, the trail rose patiently, winding among towering Douglas firs and lodgepole pines, whose trunks had stood quietly through countless winters. Their branches filtered the sunlight into soft ribbons that danced across the forest floor with every passing breeze. Jasper walked at his usual unhurried pace. His steady hoofbeats blended naturally with the sounds of the mountain. The distant tapping of a woodpecker, the whisper of wind moving through evergreen needles, the faint murmur of a stream somewhere below the ridge. Samuel never tried to hurry the climb. High places rewarded patience. As they gained elevation, The air grew cooler. The fragrance of warm pine slowly gave way to the cleaner scent of mountain stone and fresh spruce. Small patches of snow still lingered beneath shaded cliffs, stubborn reminders of the long winter that had only recently surrendered to summer. Near one rocky bend, Samuel noticed fresh mountain goat tracks pressed into the damp earth. He dismounted for a closer look. The prints were crisp, only a few hours old. He smiled quietly. Although mountain goats were less common in this part of Yellowstone during the 1890s, they occasionally wandered along the higher ridges in search of quiet grazing grounds. He made a brief note inside his journal before continuing. The trail eventually emerged onto a broad, rocky overlook where a modest wooden fire observation tower stood against the wide western sky. It was not a grand structure, only a simple platform built from heavy pine timbers, raised high enough to allow a ranger a clearer view across the surrounding forests. There were no telephones, no radios, only careful eyes. Samuel tied Jasper beneath the shade of a sturdy spruce before climbing the narrow wooden stairs. Each step creaked gently beneath his boots. The tower had weathered many seasons of snow, rain, and bright summer sunshine, yet it remained strong and dependable. At the top, the view stretched farther than words could comfortably describe. Endless forests rolled across the mountains like gentle green waves. Silver rivers reflected the sunlight as they wound through distant valleys. White ribbons of geothermal steam drifted upward from hidden basins. Far away, mountain peaks rose quietly into the clear blue sky, their lingering snow shining brilliantly beneath the afternoon sun. Samuel rested both hands upon the smooth wooden railing. From here, Yellowstone seemed almost endless. He slowly turned in a complete circle, carefully studying each section of the horizon. No smoke, no unusual haze, no signs of wildfire, only peaceful summer skies. This simple observation brought quiet satisfaction. Forest fires had always been part of nature's long story, yet early detection remained important whenever flames threatened visitors or buildings. Most days, however, the tower offered nothing more dramatic than magnificent scenery. Samuel was perfectly content with that. He removed his leather field glasses and spent several minutes observing distant wildlife. A small herd of elk moved gracefully through an open meadow far below. Several bison grazed beside a winding creek. High above one rocky cliff, a golden eagle circled effortlessly upon invisible currents of warm air. Without flapping its wings, the great bird drifted higher and higher until it became little more than a dark silhouette against the brilliant sky. Samuel admired its effortless grace. Some creatures seemed perfectly designed for the places they called home. After completing his observations, he entered a few careful lines into the tower's weathered logbook. July afternoon. Visibility excellent. No smoke observed. Elk and bison active in western valley. Light southern breeze. Clear skies. The entries were simple, practical. Yet together they formed a quiet history of countless ordinary days. Future rangers would read them. Perhaps they would smile at the familiar handwriting, recognizing the steady rhythm of peaceful summers long before their own time. As Samuel closed the logbook, he heard footsteps upon the staircase. Another ranger appeared. It was Thomas. "Well," Thomas laughed softly as he stepped onto the platform. "I thought I might find you here." Samuel returned the smile. "I had the same thought about you." Thomas removed his hat and leaned comfortably against the railing. "The Southern Patrol was wonderfully uneventful." "Mine as well. I believe that's exactly how both of us prefer it." The two friends stood together without speaking for several minutes. Neither man felt the need to fill the silence. The mountains offered conversation enough. Eventually, Thomas pointed toward the northern horizon. "See that patch of sunlight moving across the valley?" Samuel nodded. It'll reach the river in another 10 minutes. And by evening, Thomas smiled, those hills will turn completely golden. Samuel had watched that transformation hundreds of times, yet he still looked forward to it. The wilderness never repeated itself exactly. Light changed, clouds drifted, seasons advanced, even familiar places offered new beauty each day. Thomas reached into his satchel and produced 2 crisp apples. "I thought these might travel better than pie." Samuel accepted one gratefully. Wise decision. They ate quietly while watching the valley below. The apples were cool, sweet, and wonderfully refreshing after the climb. Below the tower, Jasper grazed peacefully beside Thomas's chestnut horse. The 2 animals had become familiar companions over the years, content to share shade beneath the same trees whenever their riders met. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, the sunlight became richer, bathing the forests in warm amber tones. The distant rivers glittered like polished silver. Long shadows stretched gracefully across the valleys. A cool breeze climbed the ridge, carrying with it the scent of spruce, mountain sage, and warm stone. Samuel closed his eyes for a single peaceful moment. He listened. Wind, bird song, the quiet creak of the wooden tower. Nothing more, nothing less. When he opened his eyes again, the world looked even calmer than before. Thomas broke the silence with a thoughtful smile. "You know, Sam." "Yes?" "Most people would probably say we've had rather ordinary days." Samuel considered that for a moment before nodding. "They would." Thomas looked once more across the endless landscape. "I don't think I'd trade these ordinary days for any extraordinary ones." Samuel smiled. "Neither would I." High above Yellowstone, with miles of peaceful wilderness stretching toward every horizon, the 2 rangers remained quietly watching as another beautiful summer afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. It seemed there was no better place in the world to welcome the coming sunset. The evening returned to the ranger cabin. The afternoon gradually surrendered to evening as Samuel and Thomas made their way down from the old observation tower. Behind them, the sturdy wooden structure stood quietly against the western sky, ready to welcome another ranger on another peaceful day. The trail descended gently through the forest. Golden sunlight filtered between towering Douglas firs, painting long bands of warm light across the earth. Every breeze stirred the branches with a slow, whispering rhythm, and now and then a pine cone tumbled softly onto the forest floor before disappearing into thick cushions of moss. Jasper carefully chose each step. The faithful horse knew the mountain paths almost as well as Samuel himself. Neither hurried. There was no need. Evening always arrived exactly when it was meant to. After nearly an hour, Thomas guided his horse toward the southern patrol road. "This is where our trails divide again," Samuel smiled warmly. "It seems they always do!" For a little while, Thomas nodded. "And then, somehow they cross again." The 2 old friends exchanged another firm handshake. "Take care, Sam." "You too, Thomas." With a quiet wave beneath the fading sunlight, Thomas disappeared between the tall pines until both rider and horse blended gently into the forest. Samuel watched for another moment before turning Jasper toward home. The trail became quieter still. Without conversation, the sounds of Yellowstone returned one by one, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, a distant creek tumbling over smooth stones, the soft flutter of birds settling into evening roosts. Far above, a raven glided silently across the valley before disappearing beyond the trees. The ranger breathed deeply. The cool evening air carried the comforting fragrance of pine resin, damp earth, and wild sage warmed throughout the long summer day. He had always believed Yellowstone possessed its own perfume. One could never bottle it, only remember it. As the trail rounded a broad hillside, the forest suddenly opened onto an expansive valley glowing beneath the golden light of sunset. Samuel gently drew Jasper to a stop. The view deserved unhurried appreciation. The Yellowstone River wound peacefully through wide meadows where long grasses shimmered like fields of bronze. Far beyond, clouds floated above distant mountain peaks, now glowing soft shades of pink and amber. Steam from several geothermal basins drifted upward in delicate white ribbons that caught the last sunlight before dissolving into the cool evening sky. The entire landscape appeared almost painted, yet no artist could have truly captured the endless movement of light across those mountains. Samuel removed his hat. For several quiet minutes, neither he nor Jasper moved. There was nothing to accomplish, nothing to repair, nothing to record. Only beauty, only stillness. Eventually, Jasper flicked an ear as though gently reminding his rider that home still waited beyond the hills. Samuel laughed softly. "I suppose you're right." With a light touch upon the reins, they continued onward. The trail gradually descended into familiar forest. Samuel recognized nearly every bend. A lightning-struck pine whose weathered trunk remained standing. A granite boulder shaped almost like a giant sleeping bear. A narrow creek crossed by a simple log bridge polished smooth by years of careful use. These landmarks had quietly become companions over the years. Even in winter storms, when snow buried the trail beneath several feet of white silence, Samuel could often recognize the route by memory alone. Soon he heard another familiar sound, the distant clatter of an axe striking wood. Not hurried, measured, patient. Following the sound, Samuel found an elderly woodsman splitting firewood beside a tiny supply cabin used by seasonal maintenance crews. The old man paused, resting both hands upon the handle of his axe. "Evening, Ranger." "Good evening, Mr. Collins." They had known one another for many summers. Mr. Collins smiled beneath his neatly trimmed white beard. "Looks like another peaceful day. The best kind." "I couldn't agree more." Beside the chopping block rested several carefully stacked piles of freshly split pine. Their clean fragrance drifted gently through the cool air. Samuel admired the neat rows. "You've been busy." The old woodsman chuckled. "I've learned that winter always arrives faster than expected." Samuel nodded knowingly. "In these mountains, it certainly does." They spoke only a few minutes more before wishing each other safe travels. Some friendships needed very few words. As twilight deepened, the forest slowly changed. Daybirds became quiet. From somewhere among the aspens came the gentle hooting of a great horned owl beginning its nightly rounds. A small family of mule deer stepped cautiously across the trail ahead. The doe paused only briefly before leading her two young fawns safely into the shelter of the trees. Samuel simply waited. There was no reason to interrupt their evening journey. The mountains belonged to them as much as anyone. The final mile always felt especially comforting. The trail narrowed beneath familiar lodgepole pines whose branches leaned gently overhead, forming a natural archway toward home. Soon, through the trees, Samuel spotted the first faint ribbon of smoke rising from his own stone chimney. The sight never failed to bring quiet contentment. His small cabin waited exactly as he had left it. Solid, simple, welcoming. Jasper quickened his pace ever so slightly. Even horses, Samuel believed, recognized the comfort of home. After unsaddling his faithful companion, Samuel brushed Jasper's coat with slow, practiced strokes before filling the water trough from a nearby spring. The horse lowered his head gratefully. "You've carried us well again," Jasper answered with a soft nicker before settling into the small pasture beside the cabin. Inside, the familiar warmth of home embraced Samuel immediately. The cabin smelled pleasantly of seasoned pine, leather, and the faint lingering aroma of yesterday's coffee. he lit a single oil lamp. Golden light spread gently across the rough-hewn table, illuminating his journal, compass, and neatly folded maps. Outside, darkness settled peacefully across Yellowstone. The last glow of sunset slowly disappeared behind the mountains. One by one, the first stars appeared above the silent forest. Samuel sat beside the window with his journal open before him. Rather than writing official reports immediately, he simply watched the night arrive. A gentle breeze stirred the pine branches. Somewhere beyond the meadow, coyotes called softly across the valley. The sound echoed only briefly before the wilderness returned to its comforting silence. Finally, Samuel dipped his pen into the ink bottle and wrote a single sentence. "The mountains asked for nothing today except that I notice them carefully." He smiled as the ink dried. Perhaps that simple sentence captured the entire day better than pages of official notes ever could. Outside, moonlight slowly spread across the quiet meadow, bathing the little cabin in silver light. Within its sturdy log walls, the ranger prepared for another peaceful night, grateful for another ordinary day spent caring for one of America's most extraordinary places. And beyond the window, Yellowstone continued its timeless rhythm beneath the endless canopy of stars, waiting patiently to greet another quiet sunrise. The first gentle signs of autumn. Several peaceful weeks passed across Yellowstone with the quiet certainty that only nature seemed to understand. The long days of midsummer slowly began to shorten. Sunrise arrived just a little later each morning, while evening lingered with softer colors that painted the western sky in shades of amber, rose, and pale lavender. Samuel noticed the change long before most visitors did. It was part of a ranger's life to observe the smallest details. The mountains always spoke first through little things. One cool morning, as Samuel stepped outside his cabin with a steaming enamel cup of coffee, he felt it immediately. The air had changed. Summer warmth still remained, but underneath it rested a crispness that had not been there only a week before. It carried the clean scent of distant spruce forests mixed with cool river mist drifting quietly through the valley. He smiled to himself. Autumn had begun its slow approach, not with sudden color, not with falling leaves, only with a gentle promise carried upon the morning breeze. Jasper seemed to notice it as well. The old horse lifted his nose toward the air before giving a soft snort, as if greeting an old friend returning for another season. Samuel rubbed his neck affectionately. "I think you're right. It won't be long now." The day's patrol followed a familiar route toward a broad valley where cottonwood trees lined the Yellowstone River. During the height of summer, their leaves had shimmered a rich green beneath the endless blue sky. Now, a few branches held tiny hints of gold. Just a handful, enough to reward anyone patient enough to notice. Samuel paused beside one particularly tall tree. A single yellow leaf drifted slowly downward. It turned lazily in the morning sunlight before landing gently upon the grass near Jasper's hooves. The ranger bent to pick it up. Its edges remained soft, its color warm as fresh butter. Such a simple thing, yet it quietly announced the turning of another year. He slipped the leaf inside his journal between two blank pages. Perhaps months from now, during a snowy winter evening beside the stove, he would find it again and remember this peaceful morning. The trail followed the river northward. Canada geese floated calmly upon the slow-moving water. Several occasionally lifted their wings before settling once more upon the gentle current. Soon they would begin preparing for their long migration south. Even now, Samuel noticed larger flocks gathering each evening. Nature always prepared well in advance. Far overhead, a pair of bald eagles circled together. The morning sun illuminated their white heads brilliantly against the deep blue sky. One suddenly folded its wings and glided effortlessly toward the river below before climbing gracefully back into the open air. Samuel watched until both birds disappeared beyond the trees. Few sights ever grew ordinary. Late that morning, he reached a small meadow where several visitors had stopped their wagon beside a quiet stream. A husband and wife carefully unpacked baskets while their young daughter chased bright grasshoppers through the tall grass, laughing softly each time one escaped. The family noticed Samuel approaching. The little girl waved enthusiastically. "Good morning, Ranger! Good morning! Would you like an apple?" She held one toward him with both hands. Samuel accepted it with grateful surprise. "Thank you. My father says apples always taste better outdoors." Her father laughed. "I believe she tells everyone that." Samuel looked across the peaceful meadow. "I think your father may be right." The little girl smiled proudly. Before leaving, Samuel reminded the family to store every scrap of food carefully before evening. "Bears have excellent noses." The child nodded with complete seriousness. "We'll be very careful. I know you will." As he rode away, Samuel glanced back once. The family had already spread a small blanket beneath a cottonwood tree where the parents quietly unpacked bread, cheese, apples, and preserves while their daughter watched dragonflies hovering above the stream. Simple moments. They often became the memories people carried home for the rest of their lives. By afternoon, gentle clouds drifted across the mountains. The sunlight softened. A cool breeze rustled through the aspen groves, producing that familiar shimmering sound Samuel loved so deeply. Today it seemed almost different. Slightly fuller, slightly richer, as though the trees themselves knew another season waited just beyond the horizon. The ranger stopped beside one grove and simply listened. Thousands of tiny leaves trembled together. Their voices blended into a peaceful whisper that rose and fell with each passing breeze. He had heard that sound hundreds of times, yet somehow it always invited him to pause. Nearby, several red squirrels hurried among fallen pine cones. Their energy contrasted gently with Samuel's slower rhythm. Winter stores would not gather themselves. Each tiny creature seemed wonderfully occupied without ever appearing frantic. There was wisdom even in that. The afternoon eventually carried Samuel toward a broad hillside overlooking Hayden Valley. Below, a magnificent herd of bison grazed quietly beneath the mellow autumn sunlight. Calves born during spring had grown noticeably stronger. Large bulls wandered calmly along the edges of the herd, their heavy coats already beginning to thicken for the colder months ahead. Samuel opened his journal. First signs of autumn visible throughout Northern Valley. Cottonwoods beginning to change. Elk remain healthy. Bison coats thickening. Geese gathering in larger numbers. He closed the notebook with quiet satisfaction. The changing seasons formed one long conversation between the land and those willing to observe it carefully. As evening approached, the western sky glowed with colors more beautiful than any painter could fully capture. Golden light washed gently across distant mountains. Soft pink clouds drifted above endless forests. The Yellowstone River reflected the entire sky like polished glass. Samuel and Jasper stood quietly upon the ridge until the first cool shadows reached the valley floor. Neither seemed eager to leave. Finally, Samuel adjusted the reins. "Come on, old friend. We should head home before darkness finds us." Jasper stepped forward with his usual calm confidence. Together they followed the winding trail back through the peaceful forest where another ordinary day slowly settled into memory. The mountains remained exactly as they had always been. Patient, steady, beautiful beyond measure. And with every passing season, Samuel found himself loving them just a little more. The quiet legacy of a Yellowstone Ranger. The first light of dawn arrived gently over Yellowstone, just as it always had. A thin layer of silver mist rested across the meadows, drifting slowly above the river while the distant mountains waited quietly beneath a pale blue sky. The world seemed to awaken one careful breath at a time. Samuel opened the cabin door before sunrise. The cool autumn air greeted him like an old friend. Somewhere beyond the trees, a meadowlark welcomed the morning with its familiar song. Nearby, the little spring beside the cabin continued its patient journey over smooth stones, sounding exactly as it had yesterday, and the day before that, and perhaps for centuries before anyone had built a cabin nearby. He stood silently on the porch with a warm cup of coffee resting comfortably between his hands. There was no urgency waiting for him, no long list of unfinished work, only another ordinary day. And somehow, after all these years, that felt like the greatest gift imaginable. Jasper wandered toward the fence as soon as he heard Samuel's footsteps. The faithful horse's muzzle gently nudged the ranger's shoulder in its familiar morning greeting. Samuel smiled warmly. "I suppose breakfast comes before conversation." Jasper seemed perfectly satisfied with that arrangement. After filling the feed trough and brushing the horse's thickening autumn coat, Samuel gathered his saddle once more. The leather had grown softer with years of faithful use. Every scratch carried a memory. Every worn buckle reminded him of another quiet journey through forests, valleys, and mountain passes. Nothing about the equipment was new, yet everything remained dependable, much like the ranger himself. As the morning unfolded, Samuel rode slowly toward one final overlook that had become one of his favorite places in all of Yellowstone. The climb was gentle, the trail familiar. Golden aspens now shimmered beside dark evergreen forests, their leaves dancing softly whenever the breeze wandered through the valley. A few leaves drifted lazily across the path ahead. None seemed in any hurry to reach the ground. Samuel wasn't either. When they reached the ridge, Jasper stopped almost on his own. He knew this place well. Before them stretched one of the grandest views in the entire park. The Yellowstone River curved gracefully through broad valleys painted with early autumn colors. Far beyond, geyser steam rose into the cool morning sky like peaceful white ribbons. Snow lightly dusted the highest mountain peaks once again. The seasons were quietly turning. Samuel removed his hat and simply looked, not as a ranger, not as an employee, simply as someone profoundly grateful to have witnessed this remarkable landscape. He thought back over the years, thousands of miles ridden, countless campfires, hundreds of sunrises, endless evenings beneath brilliant stars, families guided safely through unfamiliar country, children introduced to wild bison for the first time, campfires carefully extinguished, bridges quietly repaired, storms patiently endured, trails lovingly maintained. None of those moments would ever appear in history books. No monument would commemorate them. Most visitors would never know his name. And yet, perhaps that was exactly as it should be. The mountains had never asked to be admired. The rivers had never asked to be remembered. The forests simply continued being themselves. The ranger's work had always been much the same: to care without expecting recognition, to protect without seeking applause, to leave the wilderness just a little better for those who would arrive tomorrow. Samuel reached into his saddlebag and removed the small wooden whistle he had once returned to the young visitor from Boston. The grateful smile upon that child's face had remained with him far longer than the whistle itself. He remembered the elderly woodsman splitting firewood, Thomas sharing apples atop the observation tower, the family enjoying lunch beneath the cottonwood tree, the quiet conversations beside evening campfires, the endless companionship of faithful Jasper. So much of life, he realized, was built from small kindnesses. As the morning breeze stirred the golden aspens behind him, Samuel opened his journal one final time. The pages had become comfortably worn after years of careful use. He dipped his pen into the ink bottle and paused before writing. Some thoughts deserved patience. Finally, the words came. The wilderness does not remember our names. It remembers only how gently we walked through it. He smiled quietly. Those simple sentences felt complete. Closing the journal, Samuel slipped it carefully back into his saddlebag. Perhaps one day another ranger would read those pages. Perhaps not. Either possibility seemed perfectly acceptable. The value had always been in the writing itself. The sun climbed higher. Warm golden light spread slowly across the valleys below. A herd of elk crossed a distant meadow. Several ravens glided effortlessly upon the mountain winds. Far away, a plume of geyser steam rose toward the bright autumn sky before slowly fading into the cool air. Yellowstone continued exactly as it always had, living, changing, enduring. Samuel gently placed a hand upon Jasper's neck. Time to head home. The old horse turned willingly toward the familiar trail. Together they began their quiet descent through forests glowing with autumn color. Behind them, the overlook gradually disappeared among the trees. Ahead waited the little ranger cabin. Another evening beside the fire. Another peaceful supper. Another page perhaps waiting inside the journal. And after that, another sunrise. For some, such a life might have appeared wonderfully ordinary. For Samuel, it had been richly extraordinary precisely because it was ordinary. Each season had arrived in its own time. Each trail had offered another quiet discovery. Each day had asked only that he pay attention. Long after the hoofbeats faded beneath the whispering pines, the mountains remained. The rivers continued flowing. The aspens continued trembling in the breeze. The stars would return again that evening, just as faithfully as they always had. And somewhere within that vast American wilderness, the quiet work of caring for nature would continue, passed gently from one ranger to the next, like an old lantern whose light never truly goes out. So tonight, dear friend, as you settle beneath your own warm blankets and allow your thoughts to drift as peacefully as the Yellowstone River itself, perhaps you can carry with you one gentle lesson from Samuel's quiet life. Greatness is not always found in extraordinary adventures. Sometimes it lives in showing up each morning with kindness, in noticing the changing seasons, in protecting beautiful places for people you may never meet, and in understanding that the softest footprints often leave the deepest legacy. Sleep well, dear friend. The mountains are watching over the valleys. The rivers are still singing their endless songs. The stars continue their silent journey across the autumn sky. And somewhere, in the peaceful imagination of history, an old ranger and his faithful horse are riding one more familiar trail beneath the quiet glow of moonlight. Until our next gentle journey through the past, may your dreams be calm, your heart be light, and your night be filled with peaceful wonder.